We've been excavating in Gorham's and Vanguard caves now since 1989, so it's 26 years of field excavations almost every year without interruption.
A 40,000-year-old cave was finally opened, and the first thing the lead archaeologist found in the darkness was a sea snail. One edible sea snail sitting at the back of a sealed rock chamber 20 meters from the nearest beach, untouched for 40,000 years. Someone put it there. And because of the age of the seal, that someone could only have been a Neanderthal, a species science spent a century calling primitive. That snail just broke something we thought we knew about human history. And it's not even close to the most disturbing thing inside this cave. The cave at the edge of the world.
This is the identification of small mammals from Gorham's caves on the level 7. Here you can see the most important species or the most abundant species in general in Gorham's cave. This is the field bowl.
The Gorham's cave complex sits on the limestone cliffs of Gibraltar, the very southern tip of Europe, where the Mediterranean crashes into the Atlantic. 4 connected caves carved into the rock of Gibraltar. UNESCO World Heritage status since 2016. The floors layered with 120,000 years of continuous habitation. This is not a casual dig site discovered by accident. Scientists have called it the single most important Neanderthal location on the planet for decades. The question was always what the deepest layers would eventually give up. For 9 years, a team led by Professor Clive Finlayson of the Gibraltar National Museum worked deeper into Vanguard Cave. 9 years, bucket by bucket, centimeter by centimeter. Cave archaeology requires a particular discipline. Reading the stratigraphy, understanding how deposits layer on top of each other across thousands of years, interpreting what each band of sediment means about the world that produced it. They'd been at this since the 1980s. They knew the site was exceptional. What they didn't know was that they were about to hit something that would stop every tool in that excavation dead and send the results ricocheting through the global scientific community. A plug of compacted ancient sand blocking the passage. Not rock, not rubble, sand, perfectly sealed. Not one grain had shifted in over 40,000 years. When that plug came out, it opened a 13-meter chamber carved into the cave roof, 42 feet deep, completely sealed from the outside world since the Pleistocene. No light had touched these walls, no air had moved through this space, no living thing had set foot inside since before agriculture existed, before language existed, before anything we recognize as civilization had begun. The sand sealing this chamber is at least as old as the extinction of the Neanderthal species. Every bone, every scratch mark, every trace of whoever last walked out of that room had been sitting in total undisturbed darkness while the entirety of human history played out above it. How many times in your life, Finlayson told reporters, are you going to find something nobody's been into for 40,000 years? It only comes once. The whelk.
But of course, as you clean that surface, there's a lot of sediment that comes out, which may contain smaller items, sometimes the size of the tooth of a rodent or a small snail.
Here's what greeted them. Bones of lynx, spotted hyena, and griffon vulture. 3 apex predators with no business being stacked together inside a sealed cliff chamber. These animals don't lair together. They compete. They avoid each other. Under natural conditions, you would never find their remains gathered in the same enclosed space. But here they were, elevated, sealed, inside a limestone chamber with no natural entrance route. Someone gathered them. And the walls carried deep claw marks from an unidentified carnivore, something that had been inside this room and left its mark on the limestone trying to get out. But none of that is what stopped the archaeologist cold. At the very back of the chamber, 20 meters from the coast, sat a single large whelk, an edible sea snail. Whelks don't climb, they don't travel inland, they don't end up inside sealed mountain chambers by themselves. Not in 40,000 years, not ever. There is no natural explanation for how it got there. Only one explanation fits. Somebody took that whelk in there over 40,000 years ago, Finlayson said. Because of the age of that sealed sand, that somebody can only have been a Neanderthal. And get this, that means a Neanderthal picked up a whelk from the shore, walked it into the cave, and deliberately stored it in a sealed interior chamber. That is not instinct. That is planning. That is a mind thinking about the future, choosing a location, understanding the concept of storage, moving a resource from the coast to a protected space on purpose. That is exactly the cognitive behavior science told us Neanderthals were incapable of. One snail, one object, 40,000 years in the dark, and it dismantles 100 years of assumptions in a single find. Here's what makes that even harder to dismiss. It means the last Neanderthals of Gibraltar were not starving. They were not desperate, cornered survivors clinging to a continent as extinction closed in. They were making deliberate choices about where food goes. They were thinking ahead. That's not a species running on empty. That is a species running a sophisticated domestic operation. Organized, intentional, and in full cognitive control of their environment. If you want to know what else was sealed inside that chamber, and trust us, it gets far stranger and far more disturbing. Subscribe right now so you don't miss what comes next. Because we're just getting started, and the next revelation is the one that made scientists question everything. The myth that crumbled. For most of the 20th century, Neanderthals were portrayed as barely there brutes, hunched, slow, dim, barely one rung above the animals they hunted. The textbook story was brutally simple. Modern humans arrived from Africa 40,000 years ago. Neanderthals couldn't compete, and that was that. Cognitive inferiors swept aside by a smarter species. End of story. That narrative held for generations. Taught in classrooms, printed in textbooks, embedded in the popular imagination. Even the word Neanderthal became a casual insult. That's how completely science had written them off. The Gorham's complex has been destroying that story piece by piece, and the sealed chamber is only the latest blow, because what the deeper excavation layers revealed is something that completely reframes the question. The kiln that shouldn't exist.
So really, in the case of a bone, for example, once it arrives into the laboratory, it gets washed, usually simply with water, and we're very careful not to rub it or anything like that so as not to mark it. Because what we want to find out is if there's any evidence of what's happened to the animal after it's been killed or after it's died.
60,000 years ago, Neanderthals built a chemical manufacturing facility inside Vanguard Cave. That is not a metaphor. That is what the evidence shows. In 2024, an international team published findings describing a 60,000-year-old engineered hearth, circular structure, 2 channels, thick wall lining, specifically designed to heat plant material without direct exposure to open air. That process is called pyrolysis. It draws out the sticky resin locked inside certain plants by controlling the oxygen level and temperature of the burn. The result is tar, a high-grade natural adhesive. And here's the catch. This is not a technique you stumble upon. You cannot discover pyrolysis by accident. You have to understand that controlling airflow changes what a fire produces. You have to know which plants contain usable resin. You have to build a structure deliberately engineered to exploit that knowledge repeatedly. In modern terms, these Neanderthals constructed an oxygen-controlled kiln 60,000 years before the first pottery was ever fired. 60,000 years before the agricultural revolution. 60,000 years before anything we associate with technological civilization. And they didn't just copy a technique from somewhere else. The Gibraltar Neanderthals adapted the entire process to local Mediterranean resources, using rock rose, a shrub native to the coastal region, rather than the birch bark used by northern populations. They identified a local substitute, tested it, refined it, and built a permanent structure optimized for it. The resulting tar was applied to stone points hafted onto wooden shafts, composite hunting spears, engineered, adapted, purpose-built for the landscape outside their cave. This is chemistry, this is materials science, this is regional innovation. But that's not even the most unsettling part of this discovery. Knowledge that outlived generations. You cannot figure out pyrolysis in a single lifetime. Someone had to discover it first, then teach it. Then that person had to teach it to someone else, and that person to the next. Passed forward with enough precision that the specific steps, the specific materials, the specific structure of the hearth survived generation after generation across thousands of years. That requires teaching, deliberate, detailed, patient teaching. It requires a culture capable of transmitting technical knowledge across the boundary of individual lives, from the experienced to the young, with enough fidelity that nothing critical gets lost in translation across 10, 20, 50 generations. And it almost certainly requires something very close to language. Not necessarily language as we use it today, but communication detailed and reliable enough to successfully hand off a multi-step manufacturing process to someone who has never performed it and may never have seen it done. You don't teach pyrolysis through grunts and gestures. You explain it. You demonstrate it. You correct mistakes. You pass on the knowledge of why each step matters, not just the steps themselves. The Neanderthals of Gibraltar weren't just surviving. They were building and preserving a body of technical knowledge, a living library passed forward through generations in the dark of this cave. And they were doing it for at least tens of thousands of years before modern humans ever appeared on the horizon. The site itself survived only because a fast-moving sand dune sealed it at the moment of abandonment, trapping pollen, spores, and every artifact inside like a time capsule, preserving the technological record of an entire culture at the precise moment it was about to vanish from the Earth, forever. Without that geological accident, none of this would have survived. We would have never known any of it existed. The world they mastered.
And you find other things now? You're finding things like bats as well?
Bats, rabbits, shrews.
Pull back further, and the full picture becomes even harder to process. The occupation layers of Gorham's and Vanguard caves are packed with mussel shells and the bones of fish, monk seals, and dolphins, all bearing cut marks from stone tools. The Neanderthals of Gibraltar weren't scavenging. They were actively harvesting marine life, bringing it back to the cave, processing and portioning it in organized domestic routines. Sea mammals, open water fish, resources that require planning, strategy, and knowledge of animal behavior and tide cycles to reliably exploit. This was not opportunistic feeding. This was a structured coastal economy. During the last ice age, sea levels were dramatically lower. From the mouth of Vanguard Cave, Neanderthals once looked out over a vast open coastal shelf stretching 4.5 kilometers into what is now the Mediterranean Sea. Sand dunes, pine woodlands, freshwater lakes, herds of red deer and ibex moving through the lowlands, waters thick with marine life. Researchers have called it a Mediterranean Serengeti. The Neanderthals of Gibraltar had mastered every square meter of it. That world is gone now, drowned as the glaciers melted and the sea rose, meter by meter, over thousands of years. Generation by generation, the coastline crept toward them. The dunes vanished, the lakes turned to salt, the herds moved on. Their hunting ground became ocean floor, and still the Neanderthals of Gibraltar adapted, returned, rebuilt. They watched their world drown in slow motion across dozens of generations and kept going anyway. That is not a species without resilience. That is not a species without hope. 54 strokes that changed everything. Here is where the floor drops out from under everything science thought it knew. Deep inside Gorham's cave, not the sealed chamber, the main cave itself, researchers found a cross-hatching pattern carved directly into the bedrock, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the first confirmed example of abstract engraving made by Neanderthals. More than 39,000 years old. Not a scratch, not a sharpening groove, not a geological process that left marks resembling something deliberate. The team ran exhaustive controlled replication studies, recreating the marks under laboratory conditions, and the conclusion was unambiguous. The pattern was produced by repeatedly passing a pointed stone tool through the same grooves a minimum of 54 separate times. 54 deliberate strokes. Sequential, purposeful, controlled. Somebody sat in this cave 39,000 years ago with a specific image in mind and executed it. One careful stroke at a time, until it existed in the rock. Think about what 54 strokes actually means. That is not someone idly dragging a tool across a surface. That is someone returning to the same grooves, repositioning their hand, applying consistent pressure, checking their work, continuing. That is sustained focus on a single creative act. That is a mind with an intention and the patience and precision to realize it. Is it art? Is it a doodle? Finlayson was asked directly. I don't know, he said. but it is clearly an abstract design. We can say it's more than 39,000 years old, and at that time, there were no modern humans anywhere near Gibraltar. Here's why that detonates the entire framework of human evolution. For decades, the production of symbolic marks, art, engravings, abstract patterns, was considered the single defining cognitive achievement that separated Homo sapiens from every other species that ever lived. It was the moment we became modern, the moment we became capable of representing an idea in physical form rather than just reacting to the physical world around us. The cognitive Rubicon that nothing else had ever crossed. And Neanderthals crossed it first, before we arrived, before we were anywhere near this part of Europe. A species we called cognitively inferior was making abstract art while we were still on the other side of the continent. And get this, the cave also shows Neanderthals collecting eagle feathers and raptor talons, not for tools, not for food, but for personal decoration, worn as adornment, as identity, as a deliberate statement about who they were and how they wanted to be perceived. That is not survival behavior, that is culture. That is a species with aesthetics, with self-expression, with an inner life complex enough that how it appeared to others actually mattered. Add that to the engraving, the tar kiln, the whelk, the composite spears, the marine harvesting, and the portrait of cognitive inferiority science painted for a century is not just incomplete, it's a lie the evidence can no longer support. The last one's standing.
What the world of the Neanderthal looked like, it was very different from the world as we see it today.
But here is the final detail that makes this story truly haunting. Science tells us Neanderthals went extinct around 40,000 years ago. The artifacts at Gibraltar suggest the last ones may have survived until somewhere between 33,000 and 24,000 years ago. That's a gap of up to 16,000 years beyond their supposed extinction date. The entirety of recorded human civilization fits inside a window smaller than that. 16,000 years ago from today, the Ice Age was still in full swing. Humanity hadn't invented farming yet, and the last Neanderthals on Earth may have still been alive, right here on these cliffs, watching our ancestors spread across Europe. Two species of human, alive simultaneously. The last Neanderthals on one side of the Strait of Gibraltar, our ancestors advancing across the continent on the other, separated by a strip of water narrow enough to see across on a clear day. Did they see each other? Did they ever make contact? Did they interbreed? And we know from genetics that some populations did. Right here, at this crossing point, what happened in those final thousands of years? Whether there was contact, conflict, interbreeding, or simply the slow drowning of the last coastal hunting grounds beneath the rising sea, remains the most haunting unanswered question in all of archaeology. We don't know. The cliffs aren't telling us yet, but here is what we do know. Whatever ended them, it was not cognitive failure. It was not intellectual inadequacy. They were not outthought. The cave makes that impossible to argue. The door is open. The sealed chamber is open again. Its secrets are being cataloged one carefully labeled fragment at a time. Every bucket of sediment screened through that excavation grid could carry the next discovery that forces another rewrite of everything we thought we understood. Professor Finlayson has been direct about what lies ahead. As we dig, he said, it's only going to get bigger. The sealed chamber is only the beginning. Beneath its floor, beneath every layer researchers have yet to remove, lies a continuous record of Neanderthal life stretching back tens of thousands of additional years. The team believes they have barely scratched the surface of what this site contains, and the excavation is still running. Right now, as you watch this, the work continues. The species that carried the whelk, built the kiln, carved the engraving, harvested the sea, and decorated themselves with feathers while their world drowned around them. It waited 40,000 years for someone to come looking. And what this cave has already given us is not the conclusion of that story. It's barely the opening chapter. Because whatever finally silenced the last Neanderthals of Gibraltar, after everything they built, preserved, created, and survived, after they outlasted their own supposed extinction by up to 16,000 years, it was not because they lacked anything that made us human. The evidence makes that impossible to argue. They had symbolic thought, they had chemistry, they had cultural transmission, they had art, they had identity, they had everything. So, Here's the question that keeps archaeologists awake at night. If Neanderthals were doing all of this, chemistry, abstract art, composite manufacturing, multi-generational knowledge transfer, organized domestic life, personal decoration, then what exactly did Homo sapiens have that they didn't? What was the actual difference? What tipped the balance? Science still does not have a clean answer. The theories exist, the debates are ongoing, but nothing in this cave supports the old comfortable answer that we were simply smarter. Drop your theory in the comments and subscribe now, because the excavation at Gorham's is active, ongoing, and the team is still digging. The next discovery from beneath that 40,000-year-old sand seal could be the find that changes the answer completely. The door is open. What's behind it is still being uncovered. You don't want to miss what comes next.